Hello everyone, welcome back. In this video, we are going to create a stat system that will manage the stats for our character. Stats such as health, stamina, armor, damage, and more. Let's start by covering the design of our stat system. For stats, you often have values associated with the stat, such as a base value and a max value. Since we will have a value associated with a type of stat, we are going to use what is called a map variable. A map is essentially an associative container that contains two variables that are associated with each other. So you have a key, and associated with that key, you have a value. A map allows you to search the map variable to find the value associated with a key. As you can see in our example here, this is the basic idea of how we're going to use a map. The key in our map is going to be the type of stat. So, for example, health, stamina, armor, etc. And the value is going to be the value of the stat. So, for example, base value, max value. And this is going to be our base stats. So in most RPG games, you have a set of base stats, and these base stats are often modified. So that's why we need two different maps. We need our base values, which these rarely change, but they can change. And we also have our current stat value. So for example, let's take the health stat. The base value may be 100. So let's take health for example. So let's say the character's base stat value is 100, and that character takes 25 points of damage. In this case, the character's current health will now be 75, but the base health will still be 100. Base stat values are useful for defining the starting stats for a character. So multiple different characters can have different base stats, or starting stat values. And base stats are also a good baseline to use for calculations, and you also have the current stats. The current stats are the current modified value of the stat. So let's say, for example, we have a character, and that character has a health stat. And this health stat has a base value of 100 and a max value of 100. That means the character is going to start with 100 health as the base value. And if you modify that, you modify it relative to the base. And it's really useful to define a base value and a max value, so that way we know the base value is the starting value of the health. So we know what the value of the health should be. Even though we've modified it, we know what the value should be. So that way we can eventually set it back to the base value if we need to. Now the max value, what that's used for is, it's basically going to be the value that we don't want health to exceed. That is going to be the basic design for our stats system. In our stats component, we will create a map variable and create functions to manipulate our stats and functions to read values from our stats. So the stats component is mainly going to be focused around these variables and creating functionality to manipulate and read values from these variables. So let's get started. So the first thing we need to do is create our stats component. So go to Combat System, Blueprints, Components, and let's create a new Blueprint class, and we'll create an actor component. And we'll call this BP_stats component. Okay, now open it up. And now we're going to create our stats map. But first, before we do that, we're going to need a key value for our stat. For that, we're going to use an enum. So let's go to Combat System, Blueprints, Enums, and let's create a new enum. Go to Blueprints, select enumeration. We'll call this one E_stats. Okay, now let's add a few enumerators. The first one will be none. The second will be health, stamina, and armor. You may have noticed from the flowchart that our base stats map has a base value and a max value. So we have two values here. However, a map can only have one value associated with a key. And so what we're going to do for that is create a structure that can hold two variables. Structures, or structs, allow you to combine data items of possibly different data types under a single data structure. So you can think of it as a single container which can hold several variables of different data types in one place. Each variable in the structure is called a member. You might recall that earlier in the course we covered an array. However, unlike an array, a structure can contain many different data types. So let's go to Blueprints, and let's create a new folder. We'll call this folder Structs. So right click, go to Blueprints, and Structure. We'll call this one F_base stat. And inside this structure, we're going to add two float variables. So make this a float, and we'll call this one base value. Okay, let's add a new variable. This one will be a float, and we'll call this one max value. Okay, now let's go back to the stats component, and let's create a new variable. Okay, for the variable type, it'll be eStats. Then select the drop down here, and we'll make this a map. and the value will be f base stat. Okay, and we'll call this one base stats. So these are the character's base stats. Okay, now let's add another map variable. These will be the character's current stats. So instead of f base stat, we'll make this one a float. Okay, compile and save. Now the current stats will need to be private, because for the current stats, we're going to utilize encapsulation, which means we're not going to directly edit the value outside of this component. We're going to instead create functions to manipulate the variable and read values from the variable. However, the base stats will be editable outside of this component, so keep that in mind. So now let's create a function to modify the current stats. We'll call this one setCurrentStatValue. You might be wondering, how do we set a value inside of a map? Well, an easy way to set a value inside of a map is to type in add. This will basically just add a key and the value associated with that key to the map. And that's okay because this function won't add duplicate versions. If the key and value already exists in the map, then it will simply update the value associated with that key. So for example, if health already exists in the map and we update the health, this function will simply update the value with whatever we put here as the input. So we can go ahead and plug this in here, and this in here, and we can call add. And these are both going to be passed by reference by default. Make sure that the pass by reference boolean is unchecked for both of these variables, because if it is a pass by reference, we would need to pass a variable through the input of this function, and we don't want that. Okay, let's also rename this to stat. And so now you can call a function to set the current value to modify the stat. So if I want to set the current value of health, I can do that, or if I want to set the current value of stamina, I can do that. I can easily select the stat here and give it whatever value I want. And this makes things really clean and easy to modify and easy to extend. Okay, let's also create a getter function to get the current value of a stat. So we'll call this one getCurrentStatValue. And let's get our current stats. Maps have a function called find. So with this function, you can find the value associated with the key, which is perfect for what we need. So go ahead and add this as an input. And we'll disable pass by reference and rename this to stat. Let's add a return node. And we will return the value. Also make this a pure function. Okay, now we have a function that will allow us to get the current value of a stat. So if we want to get the current value of health, we select health, and that will give us the current value of health. If we want the current value of stamina, select stamina, and that will give us the current value of stamina. Okay, so now let's go to our character blueprint. Let's go to combat system, blueprints, character blueprint, and let's add our stats component. Okay, compile and save. And if you select the stats component, here in the details, you'll see here are our base stats. And we can even put that in a category. The category will be base stats. Compile and save. And back in our character blueprint, when we select it again, our base stats is now in a base stats category. You can also notice that our current stats does not show up here. And that is because our current stats are private. And so what we can do now is we can just add some base stats. So let's add health, and I want to define that the base value of health is 100, and the max value of health is also 100. Okay, let's add another one. And this one is going to be the stamina. I want the stamina to be 100, and I also want the max value of the stamina to be 100. And now you may notice, so let me add a key for debugging. Okay, so you may notice whenever we get the stats component and we get current value for stat, health, let's go ahead and print the value. So whenever I print the value of health, it is 0. Now you may have already realized why that is. And the reason why that is because we filled out the base stats, but we have not filled out the current stats. We can fill the base stats out here, but we don't have a way to edit our current stats because they are private and not accessible here. And so what we're going to have to do is create a function to initialize the current stats with the values of the base stats. So what we can do in that case is, let's go to our stats component, and let's create a new function. We'll call this function initializeStats. Okay, and we can move that one to the top. And inside this function, let's get our base stats. We're going to use our base stats to populate the starting values of our current stats. So what we're going to need to do is loop through each of our base stats and set our current stat as that value. The good thing is that Unreal Engine has nodes that will help us with this. So what we can do is drag up from the base stats and type in keys. And to see what this does, we can just hover our mouse over, And this says outputs an array of all keys present in the map. So basically, we can go to our stats component here. However many stats we have here, it will output all the keys. And it returns that as an array. And since this is an array, we can do a for each loop. And the for each loop will loop us through each entry of this array. It will start at 0, which is the first index, and loop through every index in the array until it gets to the end. And once it gets to the end of the array, it'll run completed. And so that's really useful for us. So we can loop through all the keys from our map, and we can get the key values here, which allows us to call find. We can plug the array element in here, and we can find the value associated with the map key. And this will give us our base stat structure. And we can simply split this, and we can plug the base value in here as value. This function requires a stat input, which we have here, and that should be all we need to do in the stats component to update the current values with the base values. So let's go into the combat character blueprint, and let's go to begin play. Here on begin play, let's get our stats component, and let's initialize. Okay, now compile and save, and let's test it again. As you can see, whenever I print the string now, the current value of the stat is 100. And we can also do things like, let's get the stats component, and we can set current stat value. And the current stat value will be the current value minus, let's say 25. And this will be for health. So the health will be current health minus 25. Then we can call after this get current stat value again. So what will happen here is, since we set the base value to 100, we should get 100 here, and we are now going to subtract 25 from the current value and set that as the new current value. And here, when it prints again, we should get 75 as the current value. So let's go ahead and test that out. As you can see, it starts at 100, and then after that it is 75. And that is the expected result. We can also get the stats component and get base stats, and let's find and let's print that out. As you can see, it prints 100. So the starting current value is 100. After we subtract 25 from it, it is 75. Even though we subtracted 25 from the current value, the base value is still 100. So everything is working as expected. I'm going to go ahead and remove this. And let's add this print string. And let's add this print string after we set the current value. Okay. So it should print 75 now. And as you can see, if I keep pressing this, it'll keep going down by 25. And it will also go into the negatives, which we don't want, but we can adjust that later. But this is a way that we can modify the current value. So instead of having to call get current stat value and having to subtract or add a value to it, and then set that as the current value, let's create a function to do this for us. Creating a function for that will make it a whole lot easier for us to modify our stats. And so we can call this value modify current stat value. The inputs of this function will be the same as set current stat value. So we can just go ahead and use this function to add the inputs. We're going to need this function in here anyway, so we'll just leave that. Okay, now we can drag out from the stat value and we'll say not equal to 0. This will just make sure that we are modifying the value in some way before we can continue. Because if it's 0, that means we're not actually modifying the value. Okay, and now we need to get current stat value. And the stat that we need to get is get stat. We can call get stat, which will get the local variable here, and we can plug that in here to get current stat value. And from here we can call add, and the value that we're going to add is the input value here, so we just need to get value. And after we've done that, let's go ahead and promote it to a local variable. Call this one L_value. Okay, and now we can plug up set current stat value, and the new value will be the local value. And we can copy the stat and plug that in here. So basically what we're doing here is we're checking is the value not equal to 0. So that way we know that we're actually modifying the stat value in some way. If we're actually modifying the stat value in some way, then we take the current value of the input stat and we add the input value to it. And after we do that, we set the current value, which is the value that we provided here in the input, as the value that we calculated here. And that is the basic idea of our modify current stat function. So what we can do now is we can call modify current stat value, and we can select health, and inside the value we can either add or subtract a value from it. So to add, you just enter the value, and to subtract, you just say minus the value. So subtract 25 should give us 75. So let's get current stat value for health, and let's print our value. Let's see what we get. So I got 75, 50, 25, 0. Okay, and it also goes into the negative values. You also may notice that if you add on to it, it will go above the max value, which we also don't want. So what we can do in this case is, let's take our local value and clamp it. So we're going to clamp float, and the minimum value can be 0, and the maximum value can be the max value of the stat. Let's go ahead and create functions to get the base value and the max value for our base stats. Say get base stat value. Here we can just find, add this as an input, return, we can split, and return the base value. Make that pure, and for the key, we do not want that to be a pass by reference. We want to call this one stat. Okay, and we can simply duplicate this and call this one get max stat value. And just change that here. We can just make that value. And we can also add this to a category base stats. Okay, now go back to modify current stat value, and we can just call get max stat value for the input stat, and that will be the max here. And then we can go ahead and set the local variable as the return value of this clamp. So the clamp will take in an input value, which is our local value, and clamp it based on the min and max that we set here. The min will be 0, and the max will be our max value associated with the stat type. Now we can plug this local value in, and let's test it out and see if it works. And as you can see, no matter how many times we add, it stays to 100. And when we subtract, no matter how many times we subtract, it will not go below 0. Okay, I think this is a good stopping point. Thanks for watching. In this video, we have created the stats component and set up the functionality for our base stats and our current stats. In the next video, we are going to continue setting up our stats component, and we will integrate our stats into our combat system.